Canberra, the first sitting week of the year began with the death of the Australian car industry, followed unnervingly by the news that the unemployment rate at 6% is the highest it's been in more than a decade. Tonight, Australia's Stop the Boats policy is also making headlines, this time in Jakarta, where there are fresh claims that the Australian Navy entered Indonesian territorial waters intentionally and knowingly. It's now also been revealed that earlier in the week, the Foreign Minister summoned Australia's ambassador to tell him it was unacceptable to return asylum seekers in lifeboats. To explore the week in politics, I was joined a short time ago by the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister, Josh Frydenberg, and the Shadow Minister for Immigration and Border Protection, Richard Marles. They were both in our Melbourne studio. Gentlemen, welcome.
Nice to be with you. How are you, Emma?
Now, let's first go to reports that are emerging tonight in the Indonesian news magazine Tempo, which is saying that the country's Foreign Minister, Marty Natalegawa, has told our ambassador that Australia's use of lifeboats to return asylum seekers was unacceptable. Josh?
Well, Emma, this is just part of our normal exchanges with Indonesia. As you know, we have very close cooperation with Indonesia. Indeed, it was President Yudhoyono himself who said that people smuggling was a curse on both our countries, and we are working effectively together, and it's 57 days since the last unauthorised boat arrival made its way to Australia. You compare that to the same 57 days under the Labor Party, and there were 1,300 unauthorised boat arrivals. So what we are doing is employing a range of measures that are working to effectively stop the boats.
Richard Marles?
Well, we should be working effectively together between Australia and Indonesia. The truth is we're in a period now where there is precious little cooperation at all. The calling in of an ambassador by a foreign minister is a very grave step to take. Let's remember, Tony Abbott said he wanted a foreign policy which was more based on Jakarta than Geneva. And now we have a circumstance where the kind of cooperation which actually existed in terms of reducing that flow of boats under Labor has ceased. And we have a situation where the policies of this government in relation to this issue has led to our ambassador being called in before the foreign minister. You see, I think if we're going to stop the boats, we do need to have an effective relationship with Indonesia. That has always been our concern about this particular policy that the coalition has in place. And what we now must see is the full report that Navy and Customs have done in relation to these incursions released to the Australian public.
Josh Frydenberg, is it a matter of stop the boats regardless of the cost to the Indonesia-Australia relationship?
No, we believe we can stop the boats, and certainly our record is far better than Labor, and that's what's at issue here. At the same time, we can maintain a very strong and robust friendship with Indonesia. And the fact is, Tony Abbott's first visit overseas was to Jakarta. Bill Shorten's first visit overseas was to taste the croissants in Paris. And, you know, the distinction between us and Labor on this issue is very, very obvious. We have a policy that is working, that involves turning back the boats, that involves offshore processing, and that involves bringing back temporary protection visas. Labor did not have the will to implement the policies that actually worked under the Howard government. We do, and we are getting results.
Let's be completely clear. 90% of the flow of boats had stopped by the time of the election.
The policy,
right. Well, it's actually true. The facts are there and they're on the public record. The policy difference which has had the effect is the PNG arrangement which Labor put in place, and the best thing that this government is doing is continuing on prosecuting the PNG arrangement. But it is absolutely essential that we maintain a strong relationship with Indonesia, and it's simply not right for Josh to say that what is going on at the moment is a policy which is continuing a strong and friendly relationship with Indonesia. Calling in an ambassador is an enormously serious step to take. We're in a situation where we are seeing as strained a period in our relationship with Indonesia as we have ever had. And this was a government who said that it was going to have a foreign policy more based on Jakarta than Geneva. everybody knows that if we're going to have a sustainable position in stopping the boats, we have to work cooperatively with our nearest neighbour, the place from which the boats are coming. That's plain common sense.
And we're doing that.
But you are not.
That
is the point. You are absolutely not.
Josh Frydenberg, there's also been a report tonight in Guardian Australia referring to the Indonesian Navy spokesman, Commander Antung Surapati, who's reportedly said that the Australian Navy knowingly and intentionally entered Indonesian waters on January the 6th. Now, this seems to contradict statements by the head of Operation Sovereign Borders, Lieutenant General Angus Campbell, that those incursions, of which there have been several, had been unintentional.
Well, there has been an unreserved apology by Australia to Indonesia for what is unintentional incursions, and the inquiry was launched, and we are very confident that this will not happen again. But, you know, the person who is strained here is Richard Marles, because he knows that on Labor's watch there were 50,000 unauthorised boat arrivals. More than 1,000 people tragically lost their lives at sea, Emma, and there was an $11 billion budget blowout. We make no apologies for the tough measures that we're taking. The Australian people gave us a mandate at the last election to do it.
And no
We're now
apologies,
implementing
pardon for the interruption, but no apologies for entering Indonesian sovereign waters?
No, we absolutely have given an apology for that, Emma, but we make no apologies for the tough measures that we are taking, because it's delivering results, and this is what the Australian people expect of us.
And so what about these reports that they could not have been unintentional? What does your government say to that?
Well, we don't believe that they were intentional. In fact, we have apologised for them, and we do not want them to happen again. And we understand we need close cooperation with Indonesia to see a policy that works over the long term, and we are very pleased with the results so far, but this is an ongoing challenge for the Australian government, for the Australian Navy, for Customs. We're deploying all the assets possible, we're getting results, and it's been 57 days since the last unauthorised boat arrival hit Australia.
A brief response from you, Richard Marles.
Well, in a week where the Australian ambassador to Indonesia has been called in by their foreign minister, you could fool me that this government has any regard for our relationship with Indonesia at all when it comes to cooperation around asylum seekers. But I think the comments of the commander in the Indonesian Navy, the significance of that is that it only highlights the importance that the report that's been done by our Navy and our Customs in relation to these incursions needs to be released, and it needs to be released in full. The Australian people have to have complete confidence about what occurred in relation to these events and have a sense of confidence that it won't happen again, because it obviously goes to the heart of having a cooperative relationship with Indonesia, and with all else that has occurred under the Abbott government's watch, it is essential that this is a matter which is cleared up.
Now let's leave that topic and move on to the economy. Josh Frydenberg, in his election victory speech, Tony Abbott said Australia was open for business. How does that square with the decision by an entire industry to pack up and leave the country?
If you're talking about the car industry, well, that's a legacy of the policies of the previous government. We know that the carbon tax imposed an extra $400 per vehicle manufactured in Australia. We know that the industrial relations climate, including the empowered union movement, made it very difficult for these companies to turn a profit. This is not a decision that's been made in the last few weeks or indeed the last few months. These have been long-term decisions. And don't forget, Emma, that Mitsubishi closed on Labor's watch. You then had the Julia Gillard give $34 million of taxpayers' money to Ford, saying it would create 300 jobs, only a few months later to see hundreds of jobs go. And then with Holden, Julia Gillard announced a $215 million package, promising the Australian people that Holden would stay to 2022. That never, ever eventuated. In fact, it was Labor's own John Button who said we need a car industry, but one that stands on its own 2 feet. And we do not want to see the Australian taxpayer be an ATM for free enterprise. The time of subsidies is over, and what we need is more efficient Australian industries standing on their own 2 feet.
Richard Marles, there has been a perception building that if Labor was still in power, you'd be sending good money after bad.
Well, that's completely wrong. If Labor was in power, I firmly believe that the car industry would be here today. And this is not about Labor's policies. I mean, the government, it's part of their talking points to say carbon tax at every opportunity, but that's certainly not been spoken of by any of the car companies in the decisions that they've made. And frankly, the attempt to blame all of this on working people is shameful. And we saw the very extraordinary situation during the week of Toyota specifically coming out and making clear, against what Joe Hockey has said, that they have the utmost regard for their workforce, and it was not a factor in the decision that they ultimately took. Having a car industry is a conscious decision of a government. In every country where there is a car industry, it is in effect a public-private partnership. Now, those last comments that you heard from Josh Frydenberg said everything about the attitude of this government. They do not want to be a partner in the industry, in the car industry, and indeed it sends a frightening warning about the future of manufacturing in this country more generally. And you're absolutely right, Emma, in your original question. Tony Abbott suggesting that Australia is open for business. When you look at the decision that was made in relation to GrainCorp, it was specifically a decision to say we are closed for business, and for those businesses that are operating within this environment, such as the car industry, they are now being kicked offshore. That's what Tony Abbott is doing.
Can I just say, Emma, Richard's got a bit of convenient amnesia here, because Max Yasuda, the head of Toyota, went out on the front page of the Financial Review and said industrial relations was a problem for their company. Just weeks before their announcement, they were in the federal court trying to change the enterprise agreement to try to get a better deal for the company. Holden talked about the carbon tax. The fact is, Mr. Mitsubishi closed under your watch. Richard, you're in denial about this issue. Think about the long-term interests of the taxpayers, not just the union movement.
Well, let's talk about the long-term interests of Australian workers, Josh Frydenberg. Tony Abbott said a coalition government would create 1 million jobs within 5 years. Is that still a core promise?
Absolutely, and in fact, you know, the unemployment has ticked up to 6% just this week, and the unemployment figures are an actual economic indicator that lags behind, you know, the rest of the economy. And the fact is, it's the policies of the last 6 years, Emma, not the last 6 months, that have been responsible for that uptick in the unemployment numbers. Because when Labor took office, unemployment was 4.4%. Then when they left office, it was 5.7%, and they predicted it to go to 6.25%. We do not want to go to the bad years of the Keating government where unemployment nearly hit 11%. That's why we're introducing a whole lot of policies like getting rid of the carbon tax, the mining tax, reintroducing the Australian Building and Construction Commission, getting rid of $1 billion of red and green tape. In fact, Greg Hunt has approved more than $400 billion of investment projects just in the 5 to 6 months we've been in office. So we're getting on with business. We want to supercharge the economy, and the way we can do that is to shrink the size of government, not to expand it.
Richard Miles?
We led a government which during the global economic crisis saw an increase in the amount of employment in Australia, an increase in the amount of employment, where our OECD counterparts actually saw employment decline. What we did in relation to employment during the global economic crisis stood out in the world in terms of being best practice in keeping jobs. What we've seen since Tony Abbott has come to power is a government which is utterly indifferent to fighting for Australian jobs. They have no heart when it comes to that. They have let the car industry go. They have made the conscious decision that they don't want it as part of our economy, and the effect that that is going to have more broadly on manufacturing is truly fearful. Now, in that context, where we see the largest manufacturing hemorrhage that we have in Australia's economic history, where we see an industry which has been in our country since the 1920s pack up and leave, to suggest that Tony Abbott is going to be able to create 1 million jobs in that environment beggars belief.
Josh Frydenberg?
Look, we're absolutely to repeat the successes of the Howard government. In the nearly 12 years that John Howard and Peter Costello were controlling the Australian economy, we created more than 2 million new jobs, a 22% increase in real wages. Unemployment and inflation were at 3-decade-year lows. I mean, we've done this before, Emma. We've got the wherewithal, we've got the personnel, and we've got the policies to actually deliver the growth and the employment for the Australian people that Labor never did, and that when we were last in government we did, and we'll do it again.
Well, global circumstances are a bit different now, and to keep manufacturing going, well, they are. I mean, there was a thing called the global economic crisis. It did actually happen, even though the Liberals seek to deny that. And to keep manufacturing going in Australia today now is going to require a government which is prepared to fight for Australian jobs, and that is certainly not the government we have with Tony Abbott.
Unfortunately, we have to leave it there, gentlemen. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, Josh.